Welcome to Reward Nerds, the podcast that deep dives into the areas of compensation and benefits. My name is Jon, and I'm your host, and I'm your fellow Reward Nerd. Welcome to this episode of Reward Nerds. Today, I'm joined by a person I've known for many years that has plenty of years of experience within the rewards field, and we're going to look into the concept of differences between the US side of things, how that has been seen in a reward setting, but based on a person from a European setting. So we'll look into some of those differences, how that is being looked upon, but we'll also be looking at how is it to be part of a large subsidiary of a global brand. And by the way, we will not be revealing what brand this is. There are always restrictions with the big companies, but it is one of the very, very well-known brands in the world. So with that, welcome, Søren.
Thank you.
Great to have you here. You just actually flew in from the US last week, and you're just visiting Europe and Denmark for a couple of weeks.
That is correct, yes.
And you've been start from the beginning in a sense. When did you start working with rewards?
I think it was back in 2001. Actually,
2001.
I entered the world of rewards. Yes.
Did you invent rewards? I mean, no.
Not quite, but I mean the company that I worked from back then, which is also a big a global company with a headquarter in Denmark, rewards or compensation and benefits was in fact very new at that point in time, and it was only being looked at from, I would say, a top 100, but the journey we then took it on was like slowly deploying the ideas behind more structured rewards throughout, or down through to lower levels as well. So that was very much a part of the journey back then.
Yeah, and as I remember it, actually, I think I started working with that company, and I think with yourself as well back in 2006 or so. Mm-hmm. And back then, I remember I was it was very traditional in the approach towards compensation and benefits and rewards, in the sense that it was a lot about hierarchy. I remember at least one thing that surprised me back then. Maybe it's changed now, maybe it still remains, but the parking spaces around the area were actually determined by what level you were in the organization.
That is actually correct, yeah. You could get from certain level in the organization, you could get what was called like a parking permit, which would basically take you a little closer to the building, and you didn't have to walk that far to get to your work. It was a bit silly, whereas people that were below that level would have to like park a little further away. But yeah, to some, I think it was like a status symbol that you had this special thing, and to be honest, I don't know if it's there any longer.
It might be, and again, yeah. We're not going to reveal the name of that one either, because it's not about naming anyone. But there has been a big development throughout these years. I mean, certainly, I think just to change, a lot of companies still call it compensation and benefits, and nothing wrong with that.
Right.
But I think it's being more and more associated with the transactional stuff around how we're working, whereas rewards often gets connected with total rewards and kind of the whole experience. Mm-hmm. So in reflections on kind of the development of that from 2001 until now, 2025?
Yeah, as I said in the beginning, when I started working and coming into rewards, which was a fairly new area for me, because I didn't have a background in HR. I actually came from a more financial/legal background. I came from the tax department, actually, one of the big four companies, and actually had set out my career within being a tax advisor. But I ran a big project for a client, which I then introducing an LTIP program for the first time, and my task was to investigate what are the tax consequences in all the countries where they were planning to introduce this new LTIP scheme or program, And it was by the end of that I was called and asked if I would like to move over into the world of HR and more so in compensation. And they also needed one that could have some in-house tax advisory for the expats, which I did for some years. And then, rewards and comp and ben just took up more and more of my time, and I got out of the tax part. But yes, certainly in the beginning, the rewards and comp and ben was mainly for the top. It was very much around how we set the salaries, how do we benchmark. There was a variable element, and I remember I was very much pushing for deploying that variable element down to lower levels, because there was a bonus part, but it was like a fixed amount, and it was not a big part of the total rewards package. And so when we benchmarked externally, there was no doubt we were competitive on base, but when you then added the bonus element, I recall that we started to fall short, because it was only for the lower level salaried positions, I would say a rather small fixed amount. And so slowly we got that introduced to lower levels, where it became a more percentage-based variable pay, which was then obviously graduated based on level and the benchmarking we did.
Yeah. And that kind of leads me to, it's always interesting when we talk about variable pay, and then everyone starts immediately thinking of, well, one thing is within levels in a country, but it's the big variances is more between countries.
Yeah.
And you can kind of say the biggest traditional outlier in that sense. On the one side, you could say the Nordic countries are somewhat outliers in the low end in terms of percentages, whereas the US is the opposite.
Yeah.
Variable pay is king, many positions there. Yeah. And that kind of takes me to kind of the theme of this podcast is looking at some of these differences that we see between kind of the US angle of things and the European one. And both in the position you just mentioned and the one you're in now, it's a European-based headquartered company, but with big presence in the US.
Yes.
And you're currently located in the US with this company and been so for a long time.
Yeah.
So when you're kind of reflecting on that, I think there are a couple of angles we should approach. One is kind of the overall differences. We're not just talking about, yes, there is a higher variable pay, but there are other things too. Right, the benefits is a much bigger element in the US, etc. But I'm curious to, how does this impact the way that you think within rewards when you're physically in a big subsidiary in a very large market versus when you were sitting, at the global headquarters, seeing it from a distance?
I don't know if my personal view, because I've although moved to the US some years ago within the company, that my personal view on rewards has changed so much. But you're absolutely right that in the US, variable is a bigger part of the package, and it's usually more aggressive. And the higher you get up in the hierarchy, it starts to become a really big part of the package for sure. And as you mentioned, I think the biggest, and also from a mindset perspective of what's important to people. So we have to understand that in most European countries, and Denmark is no exception, is where healthcare, the ability to just go to the doctor, go to the hospital if an emergency should happen, or any kind of illness that would have you need you to go inpatient in a hospital. We basically take that for granted, because all that healthcare system security network is financed through a higher tax. In the US, you pay a lower tax, but then at the same time, healthcare is usually financed through it's taken care of through your job. So if you have a good job in the US, you typically also have a pretty good healthcare package where, there are different models, but some employers, that's not that many, but but pay everything. So then healthcare is free for you. But most companies has a model where they pay the majority of whatever the cost of healthcare is, and it's actually both healthcare, it's also dental. They pay the biggest premium, and they then as an employee you pay a part of it as well, which could either be like a 1-4 or 1-5 ratio is not uncommon, and that is actually then a pre-tax deduction, so it's withheld within your paycheck. So in that way, it's actually a pre-tax payment, but it's still a quite significant amount that you pay even for your own part of it. So if you don't have a good job in the US, then I wouldn't say you're doomed. You can always go to the hospital. The thing is just then you really won't get the best doctors and stuff, and really not where you wish to go.
Yeah.
So that has been my biggest, and when I first moved there, kind of knew it in advance, but it's different when you then first start living under those conditions for yourself. It's like, whoa, I actually have fantastic benefits where I am, but that could stop the day I'm not here any longer, and then what? And I think, especially where I work right now, I know that for a fact that we have state-of-the-art benefits and the coverage that we offer, and I would say we are in top tier of what benefit packages are like, and I think we could do much better in communicating the value of that, because employees quickly take things for granted and it becomes an entitlement. But if they don't know what else is typically out there and what's been offered, they have no comparison, right? And there, I think that a lot more could be done to communicate the value of the benefits, for sure.
Yeah, and it's one of the things I've always been fascinated by, actually, is we talked about, and in this podcast I talked a lot about, the biggest cost of the company is actually the full rewards package, right?
Yes.
It's so that companies do not communicate, do not even show in full, what you're being offered is kind of interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And there are pretty easy tools to do this. I don't personally think that making a total reward statement is very difficult. What is difficult there is you need to make a few choices. You need to make some choices in terms of how you present it. My personal view to take that is that you need to put the full value in dollar terms or whatever currency you have on the actual amounts, on the things that actually have, fundamentally has a monetary value that cannot be disputed.
Mm-hmm.
But everything else you should kind of present in text and show what that is, because the value differs from employee to employee, life situation to life situation. It makes a difference if you have 4 kids or if you're a single person close to retirement or a young person just starting your career, in terms of what benefits you need and what it would cost you to have it insured, et cetera, et cetera. So I find that kind of fascinating, actually. How many companies that spend vast amounts, but they actually do not even tell their employees in full what this means.
Right.
And I'm wondering to what degree that could be a huge retention tool. So, we're always talking about somehow there's always an element of the war on talent. It goes in waves, how much it is and how the employment market looks, etc. But there's always a war on talent. You want to attract the best candidates for the lowest possible price, in a sense. And you also want to retain people, good people, not lose them at the very least for the wrong reasons.
Yeah.
And thereby, at the very least, showing them what you do give them. That seems to be like a no-brainer.
Mm.
So, and then speaking of that, if we then think of retention, have you reflected in any way in terms of, does it impact the way people consider risk? If you know that the way or the reason that you can get treated in a good way is to keep your job, does that impact kind of the risk of just resigning?
Mm. No, in terms of that total reward statement, I actually completely agree with you that there is a lot of value in that, and I've been an advocate for it for quite some years. However, it seems to be one of those that become kind of like would be nice to have, but as long as there are improvements to like make on the fundamentals, so the content of the total reward package, the presentation of it seems to be the one that is down prioritized at the end, because you only have so many projects and resources at hand, and so I've not in any like in my years of rewards been in a, like where we had a really good total reward statement, but for sure, I mean the more you can illustrate and display to the employees what they actually all get. And I agree with you that there are some benefits that where it simply doesn't make sense to put a value on it, because I know of companies that do what they call a total reward statement, and then they show what the cost for the company providing that benefit should also be the value for the employee. And there I totally disagree, because there could be benefits that some employees don't even utilize. And if that is the case, then it doesn't really matter what the cost of that benefit is for the company, because it's like the perceived value, unless it is a benefit where the value is more tangible, like a retirement contribution or pension, where it's typically a percentage of your pay. That is one of the more very tangible benefits. And then there are others where I think it's better to just list them, as you say, and say we actually offer this. Some might find a tremendous value in that, and other may not, but it doesn't take away that the company still has this palette of great benefits being offered.
Mm. So in that, without again in any way revealing the company in this case, but it's like a top brand in terms of being recognized and also respected. Does that in any way, do you think, impact how easy it is to recruit people, and does it impact in any way the way that you think in rewards of how you could kind of potentially, theoretically anyway, allow yourself to be paying differently?
No, I for sure believe that a strong brand can help retaining people, as long as you still have a good pay and a fair pay system. I mean, even when, and I think most companies they do that as part of it. If they do like an annual engagement survey for the employees, there are typical questions around like how happy are you sharing where you work with others? Would you recommend working for this company to others? And I do believe that if you in general score high on those questions, there is a correlation over to retention, because I mean the whole like job satisfaction and happiness. If you feel great going to work because it's a good place to work, and also you're proud of telling others where you work, I mean that is probably to some extent more important to some than even the pay, as long as the pay is not bad. But I actually do think that but with having a strong brand, you definitely can get away with not being the pay leaders, as long as you still maybe pay around what could be expected at median. But as I just said, in the US, if you then are like very good on the benefits, that in itself is huge.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And this is one of the key differences, obviously, between the US and the European, and certainly the Northern European side of things, where benefits in many ways it's a perk, it's nice, but it's nice, right? Outside of the pension plan, of course, which is important.
Yeah.
And I'm still a little bit curious around, you could say, this difference and the feeling, in a sense, of having been, in your positions, you've been in the global functions and also being global functions both, within the actual headquarters and now, outside of the headquarters. Does that in any way feel different?
No, I actually don't feel with all the tools we have at hand now, and a lot of meetings today happening through Microsoft Teams or whatever, Zoom, they take place in that way. Anything, I think it's become easier to feel included, almost regardless where you sit in the world.
Yeah.
And also with remote work for a lot of companies, hybrid work models that actually allows people to work from home either all of the time or some days of the week. It just has, like, over the last few years, it has just become a complete new ways of working.
Yeah. And then if we're looking kind of trying to look a little bit ahead and saying, all right, so now there are developments. Again, this is also not a political podcast, so it's not about this. Is just what do we see, what do we hear, and currently we're in the midst of this. Is now in March 25 for people listening in. Plenty of discussions going on with the whole DE&I scheme, and we're going to have a different episode or a couple of different episodes on that with DE&I experts.
Mm-hmm.
But if we take the, could say, rewards angle of this and just look at the E of DE&I and look at the equity piece and looking at kind of the fair treatment, if you will, salary-wise, do you see any, does it feel like overall that there's a movement towards this being less important, or is it the same?
The equal pay?
Yeah, pay equity in itself.
Yeah.
So fair treatment, if you will.
No, I think that is will become even more important, and especially with the EU pay transparency coming in within the EU, but that has been going on in the US for quite a while now, and with like differences even across states of how pay transparency is being operated and executed, where in some states you have to reveal the range in job ads. In some states they may not have to, but they end up doing it anyway, because if they have like operations in more than one state, so just even for, you could say, making it easy for themselves and not having to differentiate, they so to say just like implement the same rules across states and maybe make it more or more transparent that they even had to, just for simplicity reasons, not having to operate different you could say models for what pay transparency and equal pay is.
And I think that's one of the key reflections I've been looking into as well in terms of implementing directives, as we're looking at in this case. But one thing is legislation.
Yeah.
That sets a minimum standard.
Right.
You need to comply to it. Yeah. The other one is practicalities.
Right.
And as you're mentioning here, if you let's just theoretically say that there's a company that is present in 15 different states, and in 9 of them you need to show salary ranges. Yeah. It is fundamentally, it could be more work not doing it everywhere, right?
Yeah, exactly.
In every single place.
Yeah.
and that, again, if you have a number of companies that has that mix somehow, again, it's not legislation in a given state that doesn't have it yet, but somehow there becomes an expectation.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a number of big brands and smaller brands that still show a salary range, even though they don't have to, then the expectations from job applicants will change. The whole conversation will change. Why do you not reveal it in a given company? Your competitors do.
Yeah.
Right. So that's more of an overall movement, and I think that will be interesting. We're talking to a large number of global companies, and for most of them, they're saying to us that they're actually not that interested in discussing the EU Pay Transparency Directive. Of course, they need to comply with that one, and they need to get everything in place. But in terms of policies, they think global.
Yeah.
Now, they might practically prioritize of saying the companies, or the countries where you have a legislation with a certain deadline, you may do them first. But you're trying to adapt and think globally if you're a global company.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, I think a lot of the whole discussion and the topic around pay transparency and fair pay, one thing, as you say, is legislation, but at the end of the day, it could just as well be that it's just the right thing to do. So if you are a global company, I would foresee that a lot of companies, they would introduce some of the same like practices even in areas of the world where it's not even mandatory, as like in the Asian Pacific, where it's probably, we don't hear so much about it yet, but as a global company, you could of course still decide we are doing the same things in those places because it's easier for us to just do that, and also because it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, and the right thing to do is, of course, in a sense, the most important.
Yeah, exactly.
But sometimes, and that's when you're thinking of Asia Pacific, there's probably a number of countries there as well where there's already legislation in the direction of this. I can only think about Australia at the moment that I know for a fact has it. I'm certain there are other places. But again, as long as you have 1 or 2 or 5 countries in a region that has it, as a global team, you may feel, okay, we might as well just go ahead. Let's do this global. Let's look at a rollout and let's go.
Exactly. And that was my point. I mean, also it may just be easier from an admin perspective that you don't have to differentiate and let's just roll it out.
Yeah.
For sure.
Excellent.
But I think another thing that's going to be interesting, I was somewhat involved when we introduced the U.S. rules for equal pay and pay transparency, where and they have even already now changed slightly, where we started out but not disclosing the pay ranges in the job ads, but we made sure that we mentioned the pay range when it was external hires. Now we have moved in a direction that we are actually including the ranges in the job ads. So that's just the journey we are on. But what was quite surprising was that we also had to make it very clear that existing employees could just like contact HR and get information on their own pay compared to the midpoint and stuff like that. And I'm not sure if it's like American culture. That's going to be interesting when the EU pay transparency for real hits the road. Because in the US, we did not get a lot of requests. It was surprisingly low how few existing employees actually ask for that insight.
And that I've been struggling with that one because I do find it super interesting. I'm probably one of those that are saying that I expect quite a few to be asking, but I think it really matters. Company culture matters.
Yes.
And of course, culture in the given country matters. But what also matters is the way a company is kind of presenting this right, if you will. So I'm mentioning kind of 2 different scenarios. One is if a company is very proactively, in a very open way, if it's a message from the CEO or the CHRO, whoever it might be, to say, dear employees, as you know, you have this right to get information about this. We think you should, execute that right. Try to kind of tell people to do so, to get an idea as to where you are, and then have a chat with your manager in terms of why you are placed where you are.
Yeah.
If you get some sort of message in direction of that, I think a lot of employees will think, well, that actually is interesting, and maybe reply back, dear manager, thank you so much for this email. I'm very happy to receive that, and as you know, I might be happy with my pay, and you as a manager, all of these good things in the company, but I got a bit curious now. This once I would like to know.
I think a big difference will also be that not that unions don't exist in the U.S., because they do within certain industries, but often very much with like more like hourly jobs. There are certain industries where unions exist, but it's definitely not predominant in the U.S. It's really a free market in terms of how salary is set. Kind of different in Europe, where a lot of countries, unions and collective bargaining are heavily present. So I think alone from that standpoint, I think that the employees there will be a different culture simply from the fact that they will be encouraged through their unions to request this information.
Yeah, and I think that's also key. Are you encouraged, or are companies actually trying to see if they can avoid people asking for this?
Yeah.
there's going to be a lot around the framing, and that's kind of when I said there could be two examples. One is what I said there, and the other one could be one, where it's absolutely as hidden as much as possible, and make it slightly difficult to get hold of. You could still get it, of course. You need to comply, but then you need to fill in a form, formally send it to your boss, what have you, right? So I think the way that that's being set out is going to make a big difference in terms of how many actually ask for it.
Correct.
Yeah. So any other big reflections from you? You've been now many years in the US, and of course many more in in the Danish headquarters setting. Anything that you would kind of like to kind of reveal of saying, wow, this was an epiphany to me, this was new, this was different, in terms of the differences between being, again, in a Nordic headquarter versus being present in the big US?
I think one thing that really became more visible to me after I moved there and was again looking at the total rewards package and what's important in different parts of the world, and how much actually taxes also influences what makes sense to offer. Because if we look at Denmark, most companies have from like, it varies, but they have certain point where a company car kicks in typically, and that becomes a benefit or a perk where that is part of the package. That is not very common in the US, and there are reasons for this. First of all, cars are extremely cheap in the US, so compared to Denmark anyway. And if you get it offered for as a benefit, there is quite heavily taxation as on that benefit. So it's simply not, and also the gas is cheaper. So all in all, I don't think that many would perceive it as a very great benefit, and therefore it's not a common benefit.
Yeah, and that's probably a good reflection in terms of when you're making global policies.
Right.
I've also been making global policies and starting to think, all right, so let's introduce this and that benefit from director level, this and that from VP level. I mean, it's typically pretty easy to think that LTI schemes should be for everyone at VP level plus and that kind of stuff. Whereas reality, again, the variable pay element in the US kicks in at the lower level, and again with a higher speed and higher percentage. So I think to some extent, obviously every country has different pay packages and different base salaries and all of these things due to tax reasons and cost of living and what have you. But it is kind of interesting to see it on a policy level. Yeah.
But I think even if I took my current job and said, because it's a global position, regardless if I'm, as I am now, sit in the U.S., if that job was just like transferred to another country, which could be Denmark, there is simply a significant difference in target and maximum level on the variable pay. That, again, just tells about how much more aggressive they are on the variable part in the U.S. and has been for years. Another thing that also has become really clear to me after moving over to the U.S., I knew it existed, but I didn't know that it really was so big over there, is that obviously a lot of the global companies with headquarters in Denmark have the full value chain, so they have sales. But I still believe that those sales goals or KPIs, whatever they call them, are just embedded in their regular bonus scheme, and very few of those Danish headquarter companies has like a separate program for their salespeople. That is almost common in the U.S. that a part of the whole world of rewards, that's a separate discipline called sales compensation, and that is just another big difference. That is so big over there that they have that as either on top of another variable program or that is their variable program. So they're very, very like on the sales side, so like focused on the incentive part.
Yeah. Well, that's where you kind of meet market conditions and culture in one go.
Yes, yeah.
And I think that maybe is what is needed for any good reward practice on a global scale. Is you need to have a logic, you need to have a philosophy. You may say you always want to be paying around the market median. That you could apply anywhere, right? But what does that actually look like? What does it mean? How does it fit in a local context?
Yeah.
You have to be willing to have different, bonus schemes per country, etc. But still leads me. I think that is an interesting angle. Now, it goes for your position, but this could be anyone. When you're in a global position, should it really necessarily be locally adapted when it comes to variable pay, for example? Because in theory, a position could then move from one country to another. You end up, of course, adapting somewhat on the base, etc., for whatever country you're in. But, the other things, such as, the bonuses, why necessarily is that, based on a local setting if you're in a global role?
Yeah, I think there are two things. One thing is what you measure on, which again could be global KPIs or goals.
Sure.
So those are not necessarily adapted to a more local or regional. Another thing is of course the aggressiveness or the level of bonus, and you could introduce and I know that a lot of global companies do that. Once you hit a certain level, whether that's vice president and above, they do globalize it. So it's the same regardless of where you sit in the world, because when you reach to that level, you also start to have impact on the entire company strategy, and hence it kind of all blurs together. And I think it makes sense to align on the levels when it comes to their various below. I do think that even from a benchmarking perspective, we need to align to what is expected for bonus levels in a more local setting.
Yep. Excellent. This became a lot of nerding. That's beautiful. It always takes these strange ways, doesn't it, when you start talking rewards?
For sure.
Yeah. Excellent. But thank you so much, Søren. We're not going to keep on digging because I think it's also in respect for the time, etc. I think it's great to have these perspectives. I think it's super to kind of have this. It's like an outside in, inside out kind of perspective, because you do come from a Danish and Nordic background, but you've now, you've been in the US for many years, and thereby it kind of takes that angle in. So I think that's super interesting. So thank you so much for joining this nerdy podcast.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for joining this podcast today, where I've been joined by Søren, and we're looking into the kind of perspectives of the US versus Europe, headquarter-based companies versus being in a subsidiary. With that, these kind of nerdy chats will continue. We would love to get your feedback, certainly the positive ones through some likes and sharing that the podcast exists. But also, if you do have comments and stuff you want us to include going forward, please do send us an email. You can do so at hello@nordicrewardpartners.com. That we always see your comments, and we can try to improve. But we can also certainly would love to have suggestions for future topics, future guests, and anything that you would love to hear more nerdy chat about. Thank you so much.